In the Mafia, wars usually begin with blood, a body in the street, a message no one can ignore. But this war started differently. There was no gunfire, no funeral, no declaration, just a shift in behavior that spread quietly through New York, and by the time anyone tried to name it, the damage was already done. At the center of it all stood Lucky Luciano, doing something that looked like nothing. Luciano didn't threaten anyone. He didn't strike first. He didn't even move openly. And that was the problem. In a world where violence is language, silence becomes a signal. Meetings grew tense. Alliances hesitated. Men who once trusted each other began to second-guess every word, every delay, every absence. No one could tell whether Luciano had chosen a side or decided to let everyone else destroy themselves first. What made this moment dangerous wasn't action, but interpretation. Every rumor felt intentional. Every pause felt loaded. People didn't wait for confirmation because waiting felt like weakness. So they acted early. They misread intentions. They prepared for attacks that never came, and in doing so, they created real ones. By the time violence finally surfaced, Luciano still hadn't fired a shot. He didn't need to. The war was already moving on its own, fueled by fear, ambition, and the belief that someone else knew more than you did. That belief turned partners into liabilities and alliances into targets. This is the story of how Lucky Luciano started a mafia war without pulling a trigger, and why, in the end, the most dangerous move wasn't violence at all. It was knowing exactly when to stay silent and let the city tear itself apart. In the world Lucky Luciano had helped design, firing the first shot was no longer the smartest way to win. Violence creates clarity, and clarity creates unity. Luciano understood that the moment a body hit the ground, his enemies would stop competing with each other and start aligning against him. A public strike would have drawn lines too cleanly, too fast. So he did something far more destabilizing. He withheld action. In mafia politics, inaction is never neutral. When a powerful figure stays silent at the exact moment violence is expected, that silence becomes interpretable. Is he preparing something bigger? Has he already chosen a target? Is someone about to be sacrificed? Every unanswered question forces people to fill in the gaps themselves, and they rarely do so calmly. Luciano knew that his reputation did most of the work for him. He didn't need to announce intentions because everyone already believed he had them. The absence of visible movement suggested hidden movement. Men began reading meaning into delays, canceled meetings, and routine decisions that suddenly felt calculated. Silence became louder than threats. What made this strategy effective was timing. Luciano didn't go quiet during stability. He went quiet during tension. Old rivalries were already unresolved. Alliances were already strained. All he had to do was remove the expectation of guidance. Without direction from the top, every faction began acting defensively, and defensive moves are often indistinguishable from preparation for attack. Some tried to provoke a response, hoping to force Luciano's hand. Others rushed to secure advantages before it was too late. A few attempted to reassure partners who no longer trusted reassurance. None of these reactions required Luciano's involvement. They were self-generated, driven by fear of being the last to understand what was happening. By refusing to fire a shot, Luciano denied everyone a reference point. There was no event to rally around, no act to condemn, no clear aggressor. Just uncertainty. And uncertainty is corrosive. It eats at loyalty quietly, turning cooperation into suspicion and patience into panic. The first move of the war wasn't violence, it was restraint. And once restraint entered the equation, the conflict no longer needed Luciano's permission to begin. Once Lucky Luciano stayed silent, the vacuum filled itself. Not with facts, but with rumors sharpened by fear. Someone claimed Luciano had already chosen who would fall first. Another insisted he was waiting for a single mistake before moving. A third swore he had proof that a private alliance had already been sealed. None of it could be verified. All of it was believed. That was the damage. In the Mafia, rumors don't need accuracy to be effective, they only need plausibility, and Luciano's reputation made every whisper sound credible. The idea that he might be planning something was enough to force action. Men didn't ask whether the rumors were true. They asked what would happen if they were the last to react. Each faction assumed the others had better information. That assumption is deadly. It creates asymmetry where none exists. One group moves defensively, another interprets that movement as aggression, and suddenly preparation becomes provocation. What began as speculation hardened into timelines. If Luciano is moving next week, we need to move first. If he's already decided, we need to show loyalty now. If we wait, we're exposed. Meetings became minefields. Every phrase was overanalyzed. Every delay felt intentional. Trust eroded not because Luciano lied, but because no one could prove he wasn't. The rumor didn't need a source. It needed momentum. And momentum came from people acting as if the worst interpretation were already true. What made the situation irreversible was that once someone acted on a rumor, it created evidence. Not evidence of Luciano's intent, but evidence of their own. A rushed alliance here, a quiet weapons transfer there, a sudden cutoff of communication. Each move generated new rumors, feeding the cycle. The city began arguing with itself through behavior. Luciano didn't spread these whispers. He didn't need to. His silence allowed everyone else to do it for him. And because no single rumor could be traced back to him, no one could confront him without admitting fear. Challenging silence requires certainty. And certainty was the one thing no one had. By the time the first real acts of hostility appeared, they no longer needed justification. The rumor had already done the work. It had turned caution into paranoia and paranoia into motion. The war didn't start with a gunshot. It started the moment everyone decided they knew what Luciano was thinking and acted on it. As the rumors hardened into assumptions, alliances stopped feeling like protection and started feeling like exposure. Every partnership was suddenly a liability, every shared history a possible leak. In that climate, even long-time allies wondered whether standing together made them safer, or simply easier to isolate. At the center of this tension was Lucky Luciano, still silent, still unreadable, still. What changed first wasn't loyalty, but behavior. Meetings that once ran smoothly became tense audits of intent. Men arrived late on purpose, left early without explanation, or spoke just enough to avoid being remembered. Agreements that had held for years were quietly revisited, not to strengthen them, but to calculate exit options. Trust didn't collapse loudly. It thinned. The fatal shift came when alliances began testing each other. Not openly. That would have forced clarity, but indirectly. Information was withheld to see who noticed. Minor commitments were delayed to see who reacted. Each test created suspicion, and suspicion demanded a response. Before long, partners weren't coordinating anymore. They were measuring one another for weakness. In that environment, defensive moves looked indistinguishable from preparation for betrayal. A man reinforcing his position appeared to be choosing a side. A group staying neutral looked like it was waiting to strike. The safest option, doing nothing, became the most dangerous signal of all. Everyone assumed that if Luciano was watching, he would favor decisiveness over hesitation. Small fractures multiplied. A missed meeting turned into a broken understanding. A cautious decision was interpreted as a secret alignment. The very structures designed to maintain balance began producing targets. Not because Luciano directed them, but because fear needed someone to point at. By the time violence finally surfaced, it didn't look like a declaration of war. It looked like misunderstandings colliding. A retaliatory move justified as prevention. An escalation framed as self-defense. Each side believed it was responding, not initiating. And that belief made reconciliation impossible. Luciano still hadn't acted. He didn't need to. The moment alliances started turning inward, the war had found its engine. From then on, Every attempt to restore trust only revealed how little of it remained. The conflict no longer required leadership. It had momentum. While alliances fractured and rumors turned partners into suspects, Lucky Luciano remained conspicuously absent from the chaos he had helped unlock. There were no secret meetings traced back to him, no messages intercepted, no orders that could be quoted or misquoted. From the outside, it looked like disengagement. From inside the system, it felt like surveillance. Luciano didn't need to steer events. He let them reveal themselves. Every premature move, every defensive consolidation, every quiet betrayal became information offered freely. Men showed how they behaved under pressure when guidance disappeared. They showed who needed certainty to remain loyal and who could tolerate ambiguity. Luciano simply watched the map redraw itself. What made this so effective was that he never appeared as the beneficiary while it was happening. Violence erupted elsewhere. Accusations circulated without his name attached. When two sides clashed, Luciano was not the obvious cause, just the unspoken context. That separation kept him clean. In Mafia politics, distance from the spark is protection from the blame. As the conflict escalated, some factions tried to pull Luciano in, hoping his involvement would stabilize things or at least clarify sides. He declined without explanation. That refusal mattered. It told everyone that whatever was happening had already passed the point where guidance could help. The system would correct itself, or destroy itself, without intervention. This was the invisible hand at work. Luciano didn't push rivals into conflict. He removed the restraints that kept them aligned. He understood that once fear starts dictating behavior, control shifts to whoever can endure the longest without reacting. And Luciano could wait. The longer the war dragged on, the clearer the pattern became. Those who acted first bled resources. Those who escalated early attracted enemies. Those who stayed measured survived. Luciano's position strengthened not because he won battles, but because he avoided them while others exhausted themselves proving loyalty, dominance, or resolve. By the time people realized they were fighting a war with no clear author, it was too late to stop. The violence had its own logic now, and Luciano, untouched and uncommitted, stood apart as the only figure not diminished by it. He hadn't fired a shot, he hadn't given an order, but he had learned everything he needed to know. By the time the conflict burned itself low, the pattern was impossible to ignore. The factions that had moved first were weaker. The alliances that had acted out of fear were fractured, and the men who had survived longest were not the boldest. They were the ones who had waited. At the center of what remained stood Lucky Luciano, untouched by the damage that surrounded him. The war did what no purge ever could. It drained resources quietly. Money was spent on protection instead of growth. Trust was consumed faster than territory. Men who had once projected strength now looked exhausted, compromised, and desperate to stabilize anything that was left. By contrast, Luciano's position appeared unchanged, not because he was stronger, but because he had conserved everything others had burned. When the fighting slowed, people didn't ask who had started it. They asked who could end it. That question carried its own answer. Luciano hadn't escalated. He hadn't overcommitted. He hadn't been forced to choose sides publicly. That neutrality, once interpreted as threat, now looked like leadership. Stability doesn't announce itself during chaos. It becomes valuable only after chaos proves how rare it is. Former rivals approached cautiously, not to accuse, but to realign, not to challenge, but to reattach themselves to something that still held. Luciano didn't need to demand concessions. The war had already priced them in. The cost of opposing him was now visible everywhere, in empty ranks, broken agreements, and men who no longer trusted their own judgment. What made the outcome undeniable was that no one could credibly blame him. There was no order to point to, no shot to reference, no direct move to condemn. The war had happened around him, not because of him. That distinction mattered. It allowed Luciano to emerge not as a victor, but as the only option left standing. In the end, the conflict paid him back in ways violence never could. It removed unreliable players. It clarified loyalties. It taught everyone else the price of impatience. Luciano didn't win by defeating enemies. He won by letting them defeat themselves. And when the city finally quieted, one truth settled in. The most effective wars aren't fought to destroy opponents. They're fought to make survival point in only one direction. When the dust finally settled, there was no victory speech. No moment anyone could clearly identify as the end of the war. There were only consequences, scattered, uneven, and impossible to trace back to a single decision. And standing outside the wreckage was Lucky Luciano, exactly where he had been all along. No shot had announced the beginning. No body marked the turning point. Yet alliances were gone, power balances rewritten, and ambitions quietly buried. The men who lost didn't lose because they were weaker. They lost because they reacted. They moved too fast, trusted too little, and tried to outthink a silence that never explained itself. Luciano never needed to command the war. He understood something deeper, that once fear replaces trust, systems collapse on their own. By refusing to intervene, he allowed everyone else to reveal how they truly behaved under pressure. The war didn't crown him through force. It crowned him through comparison. Afterward, no one could say he had started it, and no one could deny that he benefited most from its outcome. That ambiguity was his shield. In a world where blame is as dangerous as bullets, being unprovable is power. Lucky Luciano didn't win by pulling a trigger. He won by knowing when not to. And that lesson lingered long after the fighting stopped. In the Mafia, the most dangerous man isn't always the one who fires first. It's the one who understands that sometimes the war will start itself,